Hello everybody, in this video I'm going to take the sprite on the left and edit it so that it looks like the sprite on the right. This is one of the sprites that people send over for me to edit. This is from Luis Nogueira, a developer from Portugal. He's part of the Digitality Studio. They've made a bunch of really fun games. And this roster of characters, I think, is something that Luis is working on. And I think Luis is specifically an artist, even though you couldn't tell by looking at the sprites, because it's actually quite nice. And I make an assessment of the things that I like about the sprite that I want to not change. One of the things I actually quite like about the sprite is the silhouette, although I do change it a little bit, but more in the sense of changing the pose. I'm looking at the way that some of the volume is represented and some of the perspective. I think I might want to suggest that the body is slightly more twisted, not because I need it to, but because it helps with some of the shading on the character. If there's more angle to the character, there's more chances for me to do different values and to help out separate the shapes. So the argument I'm making here about not having an outline is that in many cases the outline is something that people don't put in because it's not part of the art direction. And I do a little bit of test of having the outline outside of the character and inside of the character. And although that sort of changes the art direction a tiny bit, it helps increase the separation between some of the elements. I'm taking the time now here to pick all the colors in the palette, and we come out to a actually quite large palette for such a small sprite. And as you can see even now, there's a lot of colors that sort of blend together as soon as you zoom out. And this isn't something that is necessarily wrong. It's more that it's something that can be a little bit overbearing when it comes to production. Because now you're doing a lot of painting and overpainting and picking sprites and picking pixels, making sure that if you do some pixel motion, you're actually not going out of the palette or remembering to reshade some parts. And there's a lot of pixels that are really, really close together in value and even in hue. And instead of having the colors laid out in strips like that, I actually like to have them sort of come together in a sort of common end point, and ideally in a common start point, which is a little bit more like the I think it's Henry Munsell kind of palette techniques or studies, where if it's really bright and really dark, you never have that much saturation. So colors tend to come all from the same spot and end up in the same spot as well. So here I'm blending colors and see how much that affects the sprite. As you can see, by just blending some of these colors together, you create flat areas on the sprite. And flat areas are very scary to a lot of people. They're not necessarily bad, but flat areas means that your model is not shaded. And that's how people feel that they haven't put any in the work or anything like that. But if you look at Capcom's sprites, you'll see that they have a lot of flat areas, especially in the darker parts of the model, so in the far limbs of the model. And of course, that's an art direction, and you can actually see Capcom versus SNK and look at how each of the different art teams made the other team's sprites, and it's an interesting study. So here's the way that I would organize this palette to see if I can find common ground and common colors for all these sprites. So you can see that the colors tend to converge a little bit in the mid to dark tones over there, in sort of the earth tones. The bones are, ivory color, bone color, and then there's gold, which boils down to brown, and there's green that actually comes into earth tones as well that I can use on the little sort of cloak. That's the raggedy cloak on the character. I'm looking at blending all these three colors together, or actually more than those, and they all always come out to a very saturated shade, which annoys me slightly because I think that the shade being saturated doesn't really help make it stand away. It actually makes it stand out. And it is supposed to be a dark color, and I want colors to sort of fade away into that one tone. Now, again, I mentioned I'm not changing the silhouette, but there are moments where I'm going to change the colors near the edge, and that has implications on the silhouette. Even though the shape hasn't changed, the way that it's perceived changes a little bit. I'm doing some tests here whether or not some of these darker tones can be reusable or interchangeable. So can the dark green be also the dark red and the dark brown, right? And the answer is not really. Maybe the green and the yellow could share, or the yellow and the red could share, but green and red, that's already, we're starting to push a little too far into the sort of the different hues. I didn't change the color palette because I think it actually works really well. There's a sense of nobility with the reds on the pants, but then there's also this aspect of survival because of the earth tones and the fact that the cloak is all rag. ragged up. And it kind of feels like this is some zombie that's hung around for a long time. He's dual wielding pistols with gold details. This guy was probably a commander or something like that. So the red actually works really well to keep it that way. So here I'm changing the position of the spine so that it's rotated slightly to the left. And it sort of breaks it away from the front of the rib cage. It's more into having the sternum bone actually separated from the rest. And I also use the bases of the folds on the clothing that were put in by Luis, by the original artist, because they actually look pretty nice. They sell the idea of folds really well. I do think that they're a little bit puffy for a skeleton to be sitting underneath. So eventually I will sort of move them slightly to sort of make them a little bit flatter on the edge. And the thing I'm testing out here is I can really push forward quite a lot in the contrast here. The danger there is that if I start putting contrasting shades on the outlines, I might start to draw the attention towards the pants, which is really not what I want. So what I'll do is I'll make sure that the values work in relation to each other right now, and at the end I will do a levels pass. I will go into Photoshop, just use an auto levels pass to just make sure that all of the contrasts are equally pushed, but the relationship between the values stays the same, right? Here I'm reshading the bone areas. The way that I reshade the bone areas is just painted at a flat color, and then I'm using that tone to suggest whether or not an object is facing towards the camera. So if the object is bright, it's facing towards the camera. If it's darker, it's facing at an angle, which it can see on the left side of the screen, on the hand that so the skeleton's right arm, the forearm is brighter because you can see more of it. But on the skeleton's left arm, you can actually see the upper arm more than the forearm because it's foreshortened towards the camera. I also start reshading the skull. I left it almost to the end because I really like shading skulls. The problem is I think I started making a little too realistic or a little too evil, and I did not get that vibe off of the sprites at all. They felt a little bit goofy and fun. So I changed that a little bit. I actually widened the space in between the eyes, and I make one of the eyes way bigger, almost like he's surprised or like inquisitive about what's surrounding it. Here I changed the pose just a little, just to sort of recenter the weight of the character, and I start looking at what the bones on the legs look like. I dropped that little brighter pixel on the ankle to sort of suggest the little brighter spot for just to push the idea of the ankle a bit more. I changed the shoes for sandals so that it will let me see the bone a little bit more. I'm also skewing this foot back because it felt like it was overstretched. The pant legs had different lengths, which were kind of distracting. I'm having a lot of trouble here with the belt because I'm thinking of doing some like a gold belt. And then I think it doesn't really make sense. Maybe the buckle can be gold and then the rest can just be a belt. And I have that little extension vertically of what I guess would be leather as one of those sort of wraparound kind of belts. But the belt doesn't really sit with me that well. And it takes a while for me to then go in and push red cloth loops over to the belt to suggest that those are belt loops holding it in. On the guns, I add a different or an additional shade of gold on the rim just to really draw the attention towards the guns because I think they are a very important part of the silhouette. And there was already contrast there, but I would rather bring it out a little bit more. Also, the idea here is that the sort of the guns are creating this idea of a V shape, and so having them be bright at the top kind of helps sort of push the viewer out from the skull's face and more into the guns. Here I reshape the legs just a little, and I also pull down a little bit of the center of the pants just a little because I feel that they should hang a little bit more. Now I'm darkening the far leg, and that allows me to change the perspective on the near leg by having the suggestion of a knee right there with a bright spot next to a dark spot. Doing some high pass just experimentation. And here I'm redrawing, not the silhouette again, just redrawing the pose, making the character have a slightly different pose by moving the head forward and backwards. And in this version, I actually push it really down because I think it's just more interesting. It feels like he's a little slimier, or like he's going to try to trick me a little bit. I also changed, I don't know if you noticed that, but I changed the area of shadow on the cloth just to bring out the perspective just a tiny bit more. And now I'm playing with the levels just to see how far you can push the contrast. And in some situations, the contrast really works, and in others, it's a little bit off. So what I end up doing is I end up using auto levels, but then I bring back the difference on the levels. And here you can kind of see me just test out how the hues still work. And because the levels didn't really change the colors all that much, the hues are still the same, but the contrast is increased. And now I think the character has a bit more visibility. This is the contrast at the end, or the difference between the two sprites. I'm adding a little bit of the elements that I think are missing, like the indication of the sort of an opening on the pens, just because it helps with selling the perspective. And I think this might be a little bit overshaded, if I'm honest. But I think just the character, it just looks more vivid. It looks more, has more volume. And it doesn't really sort of stray too much away from the original one, which I think that's what the goal was. So I hope you guys enjoy this and that you learned something from it. And I'll see you some other time. Take care.